I'm going to be working with 4 different pencils. So I'm going to work with, I would recommend starting with a 2H, which is your light pencil. Now, if you don't have these, one pencil is fine. You're just going to have to work a little lighter and then slowly build up to darker values. So I'm going to have a 2H, HB, 2B, and then finally a 4B. And that will be my progression. I want to show you what else I'm going to be using. Other few things. An eraser comes in handy. I also have this eraser here, which is the Tombow Mono Zero for nice, sharp, tiny little, more precision lifting and bringing out light. And I also have this kneaded eraser, which you could squeeze and shape, and you can actually just tap and lift graphite with. You could also make shapes and create nice sharp points, and it's very accurate in terms of lifting light to heavy. Few other things, if you have these, I have a paper blender, one that's a little bit thicker. There are bigger ones than this, and then there's smaller sizes. So the tip of it and how to just smudge or blur, in this case blend, or a Q-tip, a little bit softer, but also works really, really well. A little less precision, but really nice, and sometimes even better in terms of softness and fluffiness. But I also use these acrylic brushes. They're soft. There's uniquely, I keep them in my pencil bag just for this. And I have a flat and a round. And these, both of them are small. They're number 4 or a 1/4 inch. And that is about it. So what is my first, the first thing I would do here? Now I'm going to use a little bit heavier lines so you could see them. But usually you would make these small. And I want to show you a quick rendering of how would I see the eye. So I'm going to do a quick sketch up here about structure and about the lines that I need to find. And here, down here, I'm going to do my drawing. So you can actually kind of follow along with the grid, or actually start with what I'm going to show you in terms of structure and the type of lines that I would look for as you're drawing. So number 1 is, cannot forget to stress the grip. If you haven't seen this before, if you're using this grip, which is a writing grip, you're writing, not drawing. So I urge, and I really, really recommend, even if it feels really uncomfortable, to start testing it and use this time to practice your drawing grip. And that is pencil on the index, middle finger, and then just with the thumb. So you can the first thing you feel is the amount of pressure by squeezing the pencil, how much pressure you put on the pencil, therefore on the line. But look at the range of motion. So the looseness, it's going to start here. So what do I look for in an eye? And in terms of structure, we deal with an eyeball. So the eye is a ball. So I'm going to start with a circle. Now I mentioned I'm going to make these lines a little bit darker so you could see them. So this is how I draw a circle. It may not be a perfect circle, but there it is. So I have a general idea of the size of my eye. When I have this, the next, as I'm drawing a portrait, I could skip some of these steps, but the main thing I want to look for is this line here. How do I find this line? Now, there is an imaginary line here, and if you notice it, I'm going to go ahead and draw it. Now, you wouldn't do this, but I want you to see it. There's sort of an angle, as if the ball is kind of rolling down. But what is this line referring to? This line is going to refer to where it touches and meets this opening. Now notice that this, as the upper eyelid, it reaches out, and the thickness of the skin that covers this eyeball is what's going to be crucial for your likeness in the drawings. Now notice that this line, does it go halfway or further than halfway? Is it shorter? Meaning closer to the front. So let's call this the center of my circle. And I'm going to just play with it and put it in the center. Now, if this is the center of my circle, I could actually find where this cross, and notice here, with the opening of the lower eyelid. And I'm making this it's not as artistic, it's just more graphic for you to see that this, touching this line here, that is how we find this angle, that line, where the upper and lower eyelid, and we're talking about the thickness of the line, and you can actually see it here in this drawing, in the lower part of the screen, how it would circle and it wraps the eyeball, giving it that little bit of thickness that then I could begin to, if I were to continue this, it would just wrap all the way around. So notice that the thickness of that upper eyelid and the thickness that goes around, meaning it goes behind the area of the ball that I'm going to see here, and then comes up, is what begins to give us a little bit of that three-dimensionality. There's something else to the eyeball where you have a little bit of what's called the iris or the cornea here that pops out just a little bit outside of the circle. You don't have to be that. Unless you're drawing a really extreme close-up of the eye, you won't see it. But we'll just put these ellipses and semicircles here that are going to kind of map out the parts of the eye. So this would be the iris, and then the pupil, because we're not looking at it from the front, we're looking at it sideways, it would become almost an ellipse. And there we have it. Right here, we begin to have the structure of the eye. And it's based on, notice these very simple lines, finding the angle of those lines and understanding the cavities. Obviously, we're talking about bone structure now, how the cavities, and notice this line, how it overlaps and crosses over, almost as if they were going to meet. Sometimes they do. Sometimes this is a little bit thicker or thinner, or sometimes we don't even see it at all. So every eye, based on the way we structure these simplified lines, this would be our eyebrow line, and now we could easily find the nasal bone, which would give us somewhat of the angle of the nose, and right into the brow and forehead. But I want to keep these lines simple. And there we have it. So based on these simple lines and this structure, if I were to take this image away, can you actually begin to see that in the eye that we're going to draw today? So, kind of. It's not extreme profile. I could actually see a little bit of the tear duct wrapping around, but overall, I'm going to leave these up just in case. For you to actually look and try to find those lines, that's going to be our first exercise. And I hope it was a little bit, hopefully it wasn't rushed, but I'm going to just cover the basics in order for you to see what would be the most important way of finding those basic, in this case, simple, biggest, simple, and in terms of drawing, lightest to darkest. So once again, with my grip, I'm going to begin by, and now I'm looking at the color image at the eye on top. So I'm going to look for the eyeball, and I can see it there. I can see the angle of it. I'm going to start with it, and about this size. Should be about right. Now, how do I find that angle? It looks way more, because of the angle of it and how I'm looking at it, it could be this way actually. Usually if you're looking at a person that it's looking straight ahead, it's not necessarily looking down, the angle is going to tend to be this way. But if you're looking eye level, even at profile, meaning the person is maybe even looking up a little bit, as it turns towards you, the ball, the roundness of the ball shortens the angle. And this is what we would have as we see the upper eyelid kind of become even with the lower eyelid. But there is a bit of that angle, and you need to find it. If you can't see it from eyelid to eyelid, you would find it, the eyelashes are a big clue. So notice how they could come maybe even at not as sharp angle as this one, but maybe just a little bit less. So I would kind of visualize that line. And the next thing I need to see is how the opening, so the major big angle here, is if I visualize that eyeball and I know it's turning towards me, am I going to see it, find the angle of the upper eyelid and see how far? Obviously it's going to go further than half because now I see more of the front of the eyeball. And the angle of the lower. Now, sometimes you don't go all the way out. Sometimes you could see the line. I don't want to make these were a little bit straight and more graphic. This one, as we see it move and wrap around, it's going to have that little bit of curve. As you can see it here with the eye folding away. And we see there it is, that thickness to the eyelid. That kind of actually disappears right about here and then becomes the outside part of the skin. For me to actually see the front of the eye, I'm going to go ahead and darken that area just a little bit more. And if you need, what would be the following step? If you need to see it a little bit clearer in terms of what the parts of the eye that you're drawing now, I need a little more curve here. I would actually just hint at the iris just to get a good sense of the size in the area of iris versus the white of the eye, and then the wrapping around. So this could be tricky here. You want to see it in its full thickness from the inside out. So meaning this is wrapping down and at the same time around the eyeball. And we also see how much lighter it is than the exterior part. And of course the exterior, we're going to see lots of those eyelashes coming out, but we're not there yet. So we begin to see the structure, and most people would recognize this as, oh yeah, there, I could see it. It's an eye. It's coming together as an eye. Give me 1 second, just looking for an image here. There it is. Okay. So you can visualize these lines. You could see, most importantly, the angles. And my biggest tip would be looking at the overlap, working from biggest. So this would be my biggest and simplest thing. I look at simplest, meaning shapes, to more complex shapes. So I go from biggest to smaller. I go from simplest to more complex. And I also want to work light to dark. So these lines should stay as light as possible, as long as possible. As I begin to see a little clearer. And it is the three-dimensionality of the eye that sometimes throws us off. A much easier exercise that would follow this one would be to either take a photo of your own eye or try doing it while looking in a mirror. And if you have someone that's willing to pose for you, that gets to blink every few minutes, that would be the ideal. So I'm just hinting at some of these curvatures. They're not the detail that I'm expecting to add now. And what do I look for next? So one of the lines that I want to see here is, as this wraps around, I actually see, it's not the tear duct, but as if it almost reached the bend and the curvature of almost seeing that the other side of it, the tear duct. But if you notice, we see the lower part of the eyelid just as a little shade. Sometimes it's a line. Here, it's going to be more in the shading, and we'll get to that. But we do see the upper eyelid. So here I see another line. Again, biggest, simplest shapes, it would be this one. And then in relationship to the size of the eye, how big or how thick would be this? Following the angle, also adding a little bit of curvature, as if I were wrapping around that eyeball. And then it curves down. There we see it. Little by little, I'll be adding a little more shading. But not much. Just adding a little bit of graphite. And I want to go into the iris now. And I'm going to see a few shapes in here. Now we have a beautiful reflection. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in as just a shape. Simple shape that is going to be a lot lighter. And that iris. And as you notice, it's not circular. It has a little bit of, just a little rounder than the previous up here, which sometimes almost becomes a line. The more profile you look at it, it's a very, very sharp ellipse. Here you see a little more circular, a little roundness to it. And we see some of the shadows or reflections of some of the eyelids just falling on it. So here I would actually go into my first blending. So using a paper blender or a brush or a Q-tip, not your finger. I would really recommend not using your fingers. I'm going to do my first blending, and I'm going to add just a little bit of light and shadow. So obviously here I'm looking more at shadow and blending some of the graphite, using a little bit of our paper blender here, where I can begin to even add shape. This is a very patient stage where you really have to simplify. And as you do this, what you're looking at is changes in light. So what is lighter, darker, and how do I go about it as I try to shape it as well? So notice that already we begin to see a little bit of rendering. Notice that this over here, for example, it's darker, and as it comes around, it's lighter. And I could do that one of two ways: by adding a little more graphite, or by coming into this area and lifting some of the other, a little bit of the other side, bringing some light right back into here and here, just tapping it. And a little bit of texture as well. And we begin to see it come together. So here I would switch to a 2B. I was working with an HB all the way through here. Now I'm going to go to a 2B. So also patiently, I'm going to begin to add a little more graphite. Now, staying patient, adding slowly and softly, building it up stage by stage is the best way. If you go too dark too fast, you lose it. And you actually have more control. The longer you stay light, the longer you stay lighter, the more chance of success you have to deliver the accuracy of the light, how you break it down, how you can see it. So obviously I'm getting into much more, a lot smaller and more complex lines here. And we have lots of lines to deal with, for example, here. So I'm going to get into that just a little bit as I blur out some of these that are out of focus. And I don't, as I said, I don't want to go too dark too fast. But I'll begin to add a little heavier graphite for these areas that won't be blended. And just following the curvature, adding a little bit of length. Notice where they start. They don't start right at the eyeball. They start right at the edge where the inside becomes the outside. And that's what drawing is. When you draw here with us, realize that it is an exercise in observation more than anything. And always, it's an exercise in observation. So how well, how closely are you observing and seeing the information, interpreting the overlaps, noticing that it's just lines. And it's just variations of shapes of lines. And I get to say where the line goes. And sometimes if I make up a line that doesn't look like what I'm supposed to be breaking down, then it breaks down. And what I mean by it is the likeness or your structure or the lighting. And we begin to lose it. And by lose it, I mean the patience you need to develop the slow buildup that gets you there. Easier and simpler. And never forget, you're here to have fun. This is supposed to be fun. So finding a way that makes it a little bit easier, it also makes it a lot more fun. It definitely does. I need to bring in a little bit of eraser here. So I'm going to use my Tombow, and I need to lighten this. Sometimes, I was saying, you get a little too heavy or a little too dark too fast, and you begin to lose. Because it's all a match of shapes. Well, we start with lines, and then we create those interesting shapes. But at some point, it becomes mostly about, and exclusively really in this case, about how you manage values. So anything that gets a little too dark is going to make everything else that's dark or light seem off. So the key is really noticing and managing how you apply the pressure. That's why the grip is crucial. Even if you feel like you don't have control over the line, it's best that you try and get really efficient at using the proper grip. You get better. It's the ultimate way to get better, to master your drawings better, faster. The longer you prolong, the more you avoid using the proper grip, the more you're going to struggle with control over value, control over the pressure of the line. Notice that with this grip, I could also hold it way longer. Therefore, the pressure becomes even less, and I could do all these beautiful, really delicate. Now, also, they become more patient, because as I try to rush this, I can lose control. So having it, even if you hold it like this short, where you're trying to grab control, and have a little more pressure on the line, it's still 10 times better, maybe even more than 10 times better than the feel you would have with that writing. And it's just, you got to realize, it's just because you're used to it. So just like you got used to that one, you'll get used to this one. I'm going to go for a second application here. A little bit more blending, especially here inside the eye. Some of this graphite. Blur out some of these. Blend and add a little more texture. And you noticed I just touched, other than the eyelashes, a little bit here and there is beginning to create that illusion. Never forget, all we're doing is building up an illusion through manipulating light and shadow. I'm going to jump up one more. This is a 4B. And here, with very, very light pressure, I want to be very careful because you'll notice anything I do becomes the ultimate, the darkest. So one of the keys for me is I squint. I squint, and everything that's super dark immediately jumps out. Now, I don't want to overdo it. I want to stay patient, and I want to do it slowly. I want to handle the pressure. So one way I describe it is caressing the paper. Not tickling the paper, not scratching the paper, caressing it. And caressing, sometimes you can caress slow or you can caress fast, but it's about how the tip of the pencil touches the paper. And feeling almost like you couldn't get lower. And one of the ways I describe it is you feel like it's not even your fingers on the pencil, it's just the weight of the pencil itself sometimes doing the work. And that's it. I'm going to stop here. Anything else I do? I would actually bring back a little bit of light here on the edges. That's from the early on, that eyeball. So cleaning up at the right stage is also crucial. Once I go to 4B, could I go back to lighter pencils? Well, there's a progression. So hard pencils first, because hard pencils over softer pencils does not grab or respond as well. So the progression in terms of building up the pencil to softer, darker, and creamier pencils is for a reason. So the graphite holds and layers just like we did here. And there is our profile eye. Now from here to here, yeah, there were some steps, and that's what it's all about. It's really enjoying the slow caressing and building up of graphite on paper. And that's really basically it. Okay, so we're going to go to the next, which is this one. Now, it works actually the same way. And I want to show you just quickly. But I don't want you to follow this. Here's an image. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so you can see it for a second. It follows kind of the same steps. So it's finding the lines, just like we did in the profile. And I'm going to go over it. But I don't want to leave it up because then you'll follow this one instead of what we're supposed to look at, which is this one. So I'll just leave it down here as just a clue. And it's not just doing this, the 6 steps, how we start with, again, it's showing how you can find the simplest structure. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And I'm going to do it once again. Up here, lines. And down here, I'll draw the eye. So how would I go about that? when we have a diagram like the one I'm showing you here, let me find it 1 second. The main thing you want to find is the structure. Let's see, there it is. Okay, so same thing. First thing is you're dealing with an eyeball. So you're going to have, and I'm going to make this a little bit softer because you don't see it as clear. But remember, it's about observation. So what do you see? So there's my eyeball. And you actually can sometimes read it above and below. Now, how much of the eye line of the eyeball is exposed? Usually, if we go from corner to corner, and that's actually what's going to happen here. I would have, it's almost this shape with one going up. And remember, as we go up, I'm making it a little graphic. It would wrap on the sphere, on the ball, but it goes up, across, also in a, and this is a standard. It's not exactly every shape of every eye, but standard, it would go from corner up, diagonal, still in the upward trend, and then down into the corner. And then from this edge, it would go down, depending on how the opening of the eye, and then from here upwards. So you have that shape. And this varies. Obviously, we talk about almond eyes or rounder eyes. But this as the opening from edge to edge. And obviously here we have a little bit of what we would call the tear duct. But this would be your, and it's almost, you could almost see kind of a off sort of rectangular, almost wanting to be a rectangular shape, to the next stage, which would be finding the upper curvature of the eyelid, which generally would follow the edge of that eyeball. Can you see it here? And then here at the bottom, the same. It would be just where the eyeball meets the ocular, the bone, the cavity. Usually we have a line there. Just so you can see it a little clearer, there is that thickness. So I'm adding it right underneath here, exaggerated. That thickness of the eyelid, that you would see it, especially on the upper eyelid. On the lower, sometimes, depending on the opening of the eye, we see it especially right around this side. That thickness is what's crucial. And let's go ahead and add the iris, which generally covers 2/3. Maybe even a little bigger here, of the whole surface of what you see in the eyeball. And then the pupil. There we go. Everything else, well, we have the eyebrow. So the brow and the bone structure of the brow comes in here. So again, we have 1 or 2 lines. It could go lower or it could be in the upward direction. I mentioned this one here. Sometimes you have a ridge, and there's so many different variations of upper eyelid that you have to break it down. And that's why we're looking at, for example, the model we're going to be drawing today. Just a little bit of extra shadow that comes in here, because this area usually is in the shadow. And there we have it. Basic structure from simplified lines. And I'll show you this once again, how we would start here. And we just made it to this second square here. And everything else would be just beginning to look at light and blending until we realize that illusion, the form of more subtle. But what I want you to focus is this. So these two at the top, those 2 squares, following those 2 steps, if you get to the second one, that's what you should take away. And from here, we'll basically look at our model and draw following that structure that I just displayed here, let's see how we would figure it out drawing it in from this subject. So first thing I want to see, and it takes seeing beyond. Look how interesting here. We see more of the lower eyelid thickness than the upper. That means we're above. So she's looking down and we see from above. But the first thing is the eyeball. Do you see it? Now I'm going to keep these lines a little softer so I don't have to do that much erasing, and that's what you want to do. Biggest, simplest, and lightest shape. That would be my eyeball. Now, we also have a line here. If you look at the points, and I'm pointing at here, of the corner of this part of the eye and the corner, you could actually draw a line. And that line could be straight, it could be at a tilt upward or downward. So finding that point, which would be, I would say, right about here, and I see an angle that is in this direction. Can you see it? And it probably ends right here. Now, I usually recommend favoring exaggerating, meaning if you see it like this, make sure you have that angle. Do you see the upward trend as you wrap, creating that illusion of three-dimensionality? How it goes up, and then as it meets, it's not necessarily halfway. It's usually a third of the way, a quarter of the way sometimes, and then there's that wrapping downward. Sometimes you could break it into 2 or 3 kind of sections where you could then smooth out the shape. And then here we go downwards. Remember, you're wrapping. So when you're wrapping around a ball, you're not just going down, you're also going towards the outward, meaning three-dimensionality. It's not just up and down, it's also back and forward. So this is going round as it rounds down. It's also going forward. So the illusion of that wrapping down and forward, following right on the ball. And then I would say down at what would be the upward. It's just following right towards. There we have it. So that would be the beginning. I could double check it. I actually see down here the shading. You can see this whole area. It's going to be shaded. I really, really recommend squinting a lot and really, really hard, meaning you're squinting through your eyelashes to really be able to see what is the darkest dark and the lightest light, and then you could read the in-betweens. Notice how this one here gets really dark as well as it folds. But now we have these lines to deal with, not as thick, just around. And you can see how it wraps and folds as it comes across to the other side. Very important. Maintain the grip. So I'm working with an HB right now. Starting to make the lines a little bit loaded with graphite. Just a little more loaded. Now there is thickness. So where this line touches the eyeball, can you see the thickness underneath? Can you see the thickness of the upper eyelid? I'm just going to hint at it here, but it gets thicker right here in the middle. And then it just smooths out, but we do see it right almost to the edge on the other side. And that thickness, it almost disappears. It gets a little thinner here. So crucial for you to achieve. Now here we have something interesting. The eyelashes don't show me because they go outside and they cover. But where this, and I mean the thickness of the lower eyelid, just by ghosting this line soft, making it thicker. My intuition tells me, no, that's too thick. Nope, make it thicker. So exaggerate just a little bit, favoring the side of, and notice here it kind of thins out, and all of a sudden, whoop, it goes right into the tear duct. And there we have it. So it starts coming together beautifully. But those lines, as you develop this and as you could see it, really begin to create the illusion of three-dimensionality, of something wrapping over a ball. And from here, obviously, we'll add at the edge all of those little eyelashes, and we'll get there. First, let's go a little bit darker, squinting, not getting carried away. Remember, we go from biggest, simplest, and lightest. Where now, I'm going to add a little more graphite to this edge, right over here to this edge, because we also see, remember I mentioned over here, as we get darker, there it is, right there, and we could add a little bit of graphite, build it up, comes over, and just under the eyebrow. So I'm just adding a line here. Not going for that full detail, just the dark shape there as it rounds. And we could see how this wraps forward and up. Through graphite, I'll be able to do that. And this wraps inward, up and inward, into the shadow. So it's more about really learning how to use light, how to define light and folds and that bit of the tricks to create the illusion. Next, I kind of skipped ahead. I got carried away with this, but very confident we're on the right track. I'm going to notice that to actually place the iris in the eye, well, it either touches, well, not always, but it either touches the upper or it goes up into the upper or lower. Sometimes, most of the time, it just barely graces the lower, almost as if it sits on it. Here, notice that there's space. How much space? White of the eye between the lower eyelid and the iris. And from there, just gauge your size. Notice that there's more space here than there is here. So I'm going to favor this side more. And that is how we capture expression in the eyes. Really looking at how the iris and the white of the eye, and it really comes down to these lines actually, how this was all set up. But this is that icing on the cake. And notice that I have a little bit of graphite, but I want a shape. Notice that it looks like a map of something. So I'm actually mapping the highlight. Oof, look at all those beautiful reflections of eyelashes. And it takes a little bit extra to study how reflections work, but it's not a full pupil here. There's just a hint, and you can see it almost see through, right through the highlight. You can actually see the person taking the photo, which would be taking this drawing all the way, really. And that's actually what looks like the pupil. What it is the reflection of the shadow of the person taking the photo, if you look closely. But we'll make it a little bit darker and a little darker around the edges. And how we capture, again, lines and those shapes is going to bring it all together. Pause. I'm going to give it a quick, just a little quick smoothing, blending. I really love this stage. First soft, and you will eventually come up with your own strategy, your own system, your own recipe of when to blend with paper blenders, when to use a brush, if at all. Because the way you use them, if you do or don't, and how, at what stage, only you can tell. There is no formula. There's hints like, see, I stopped with my structures and my lines. I feel it's time to move. Before I move to more definition, more lines, well, then I do my shading. I also try to get a little contour, a little bit of shaping of some of these shadows. What do I mean by that? Whatever is convex or concave, I try to shape it. So notice that this goes inward like a cave. This comes outward. So that's how we look at it. And it starts to kind of come together. Let me go ahead and clean up some of this here early on. Bring this back out. A lot of this. Now, definition of line, sharpness, blurriness, all those tricks to enhance the illusion. Little by little, you'll get more and more refined. You'll figure out your own tricks like a magician. And then everybody will be asking, how did you do that? And you'll have to walk them through every step. But they'll realize, nope, it's only through practice. You have to realize the trick by trying it and testing it and practicing it. So moving on to a 2B, adding a little darkness. Squinting, I immediately see darker saturation here. Now there's a lot of breaks of line here. There's almost one by one, and it could take a little longer to do every single eyelash. So I sometimes try to see it as one shape, but there's a lot of loose lines coming at the edge. So you take your time. There's a lot of crossing of the curvature of them. There's folding and bending. So seeing them in their three-dimensional, trying to figure out how they're working in space. Downward, outward, forward, upward, all in one line. And it's not just scratchy lines. But if you see it, it's just a curve. And capturing the shape of that curve delivers it. So it's taking the patience. A lot of them are just the letter C, like wide or sharp letter C's. But don't get too carried away. Managing more the darkness, the heavy, or light content of the graphite that you're adding. Favor the side of lightest to darkest. Don't go too dark too fast. You could always come back and add just a little more. So here, the shape and the size of it. And you see they start coming together and they begin to create the illusion, resemble it. Adding a little more graphite, going a little bit darker. Really just reading the shapes. then dealing with the lightness and darkness of your line. Notice all these shapes in here. You could do that through technique. You don't have to render every single line. Remember, it's all combinations of tricks. Little tips, tricks that you can put together. But most of the time, what works is patience, observation, of course, close observation, simplifying the information. It's kind of like a math problem. Okay, there's the problem. What's the problem? Okay, I need to figure this out. Well, so simplify the information. And the information is, well, it's got to be a line. Nope, it's not a line. It's more than a line. It's a shape. Okay, so what is the shape? And the shape is close to a letter C that goes upwards. Now, what else is the value important here? Yes, it is. What about contrast of that value? What about texture? Are we going further? Not making the information more complex than it needs to be. It's always simple. Finding and keeping it's discipline, your mind in a simplified way of thinking. Realizing, yep, it's only putting lines at the right value in the right place. And there's many, many ways to do that. But through observation and just managing the level of patience, you're well on your way. Now, the other thing is, when you're drawing this, I hope you're looking at the reference more than you're looking at your paper. That's the other big, big thing. If you're looking at your paper longer than you're looking at the image, at your subject, you're making up information. So you're not going to be able to capture the likeness that maybe you're hoping for. So crucial. Keep your eyes on the subject. A good ratio is 95% of the time. Your eyes should be exploring, observing, investigating the thing you're supposed to be looking at. It makes perfect sense. How could you draw it if you don't see it? And if you don't see it, it's because you're maybe not looking at it. And even if you're looking at it, it's how you're looking at it. It's not just close, is decoding, asking the right questions, and a little bit of focus too. It takes a little bit of focus to stay sharp. There's too much information, so how do I just isolate this area and capture the information, simplified so I could bring it over and deliver it. I'm going to move to my final pencil here, my 4B, and add the soft, caressing the paper. Not much. Just that final And then the question becomes, when is it finished? When is it done? When did I say everything I needed to say? I like to think of it as less is more, although we did do a lot here. Following that less is more philosophy, it's always better. So there we have it. Drawing the eye, simplifying the information, staying patient, following the basics, biggest, simplest, and light towards smaller, more complex, and dark. In very, very strategic steps, finding your way through observation and having fun with it.